Thank you very much, Pradipta, and good evening to everyone. Dr. Chandy and I are very excited to be here today to give you just a bit of an overview of some of the work that we see going on across the world and all the remote learning challenges that come with the disruption that we've seen tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. Betty and I work at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, as Pradipta mentioned. We're excited that the Graduate School of Education at Penn is the #2 ranked school in the world, according to the US News and World Report. And our work is very extensive. It includes preparation for teacher education. We have through all those bullet points on the right side, probably 24 different master and doctoral degree programs, ranging from policy, entrepreneurship, independent teaching school programs, medical education, reading, writing, and literacy, core teaching, learning, and leadership programs, as well as some very innovative programs like learning sciences, education, counseling programs, and the like. We're also thrilled that we both work in the Catalyst Center, which is our Center for Innovation, and focus on how we can think about new ways of teaching and learning, how we can change the educational system to be more student-centered, to empower educators around the world to take leadership in their classrooms, and school leaders and university presidents across the globe to really think about what we know about how people learn, how we can utilize that through mechanisms to change teaching and learning, and how we can ensure success for all of our students. And so as we move on to the next slide, one of the things we want to do is talk to you today and have a conversation about setting the stage for this disruption that Pradipta mentioned. Schools all over the world are grappling with the dramatic changes that have happened in going remotely online and in a very short amount of time. So as we know, and as you have experienced and done in your classrooms, prepare to teach in your classroom takes months, and it takes lots of forethought. You have to think about the learning objectives. You have to think about how the students are going to interact, what activities you're going to have. And when suddenly you were told that you couldn't go to school anymore, that your students couldn't go to school, and you had to work with them remotely, created not only a disruption, but a great opportunity to think about your work differently. So first of all, thank you to all of you who have been working hard and grappling with this transition. We know it's a very difficult one, and we really applaud your effort to make sure continuing to tap in the knowledge and experience that you have and to leverage that with your students. We also realize that school's very different, so we just want to make sure you keep the learning objectives in mind and that you don't worry about seat time. It's not the same as it used to be when you'd be in a classroom all day, 6 hours or plus together with your students. So you have to really think less about the seat time and more about the impact you're having and how you would create an approach of in-person, simultaneous and then asynchronous, synchronous and asynchronous activities to leverage what you're trying to teach and achieve those learning objectives. So it's my pleasure now to turn the podium, the Zoom microphone over to Betty, who will take us through some of the most important factors and principles in thinking about how you would structure your class and how you can continue to engage and support your students and make sure that equity, access, and opportunity remains the key focus of what we do every day. So I'll turn it over to you, Betty.
Thank you, Michael. So Good morning to those of you who are on this side of the globe, and a very good evening to all of you on the other side of the globe in India, Singapore, and other parts of the world. It is my pleasure here to speak with you for a few minutes about this quick transition that we've all had to make towards online learning. As Michael mentioned, online learning is not something that you do overnight. It takes months of preparation and a lot of experience. However, the pandemic has forced us to quickly move online. And this is the time that everyone is trying to figure out how to do this quickly and most efficiently. And in the next hour that we have together, I'm hoping to share with you some ideas that can be implemented in your classroom. As Pradipta sir mentioned earlier, my research has been all around supporting teachers with the use of technology in non-pandemic times, of course, but supporting teachers in the use of technology in classrooms for both blended and online learning. And one of the things that I have focused on is teacher beliefs and attitudes and how that translates into what happens in the class. And let me tell you, that's one of the most important factors that decide the successful implementation or the unsuccessful implementation. So the fact that we have all of you educators sitting here this evening trying to figure this out is the biggest sign that you have the right attitude and the belief that it takes to take your classroom and take your pedagogy forward. And therefore, I want to appreciate it and applaud all you educators for spending this evening working with me and trying to think about how do we quickly move online. So the first slide here, I have this question about what is your context and context matters, right? So I know the teachers in this particular webinar are from all over India and the world. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I have to assume that there is a minimal access to technology that you have. So if you are in a school or a district or a space where most of your students don't have access to technology, then the kind of ideas and the kind of instructional strategies you would take would be paper-based and not so much technology-based. So for this, I'm just going to assume everybody has at least a minimal access to technology. And we'll talk more about what these different levels of access looks like. We had our children in class from, I don't know if your school ran from 7 to 2 for 7 hours a day, 6 hours a day at least. However, when it comes to online learning, that is not a viable expectation. So if they are able to engage with the content that you create for a couple of hours, that's about what you can expect, 2, 3, 4 hours. And that should be, I think, a maximum amount of time that somebody who is 8 or 10 or 12 should be working on a computer for studies. And then you also might want to consider there might be homes where 3 children, but only 1 home computer. So that might be another reason you might want to limit the amount of stuff that you have for your students. And the third thing is parental support. So some kids may have parental support, some kids may not have parental support. Some parents have 3 kids in the house, and being able to support 3 different age groups is also a lot to ask of the parents. So these are some of the contextual issues that you need to keep at the back of your mind as you are thinking about designing your learning environments. So let me start with the question, what are some examples of learning goals for your course? Now, we are all used to going to a classroom, being able to speak to our children, have conversations around whatever it is or history, and teach them together engage in this content. However, with this situation, you have to step back from your classroom, step back from your subject, step back from the whole scene, back inside and say, what was the learning goal? By this lesson or by this unit, what did I want, or what did the creators of the curriculum want the students to walk away with? What is the content they need to learn? What are the skills they need to develop? And what is it that they should be able to do if they learn this lesson? And after you have listed out your learning goals for that unit, you have to ask yourself, how does learning happen? And learning does not always happen by just listening to a teacher. Learning happens because a student engages in that content. So then you need to think about what kinds of learning activities can I do with this online format that matches my learning goals. So for example, if you're a science teacher or math teacher, you might consider pre-recorded lectures, small group discussions, and problem-solving sessions. Let's start with that pre-recorded lectures. Now, I am a huge fan of pre-recorded lectures for young children. As a teacher teaching 10-year-olds how to add fractions. So in a live session, in a Zoom session like this, perhaps you can show your students how to add fractions. Here's 2 by 3 plus 3 by 5. Here's how you can show the steps and how to think through it in a live session. However, if you are able to pre-record yourself explaining that same thing and put it in a place where it's accessible for your students can listen to it the first time. If they don't get it, they can listen to it a second time, a third time, a fifth time. Now that's not possible in a class. You can say something twice, but it's definitely not worth your time to be repeating something times in a live session, be it face-to-face or Zoom. So recording content-based, very technical topics is a good idea because it gives the child the opportunity to go back and listen to that lecture over and over again. And if the child heard it 3 times and still didn't hear it, then if they're able to ask their parent for support, at least the parent is able to see how the teacher is explaining it and then help the child with it. Because sometimes, the way parents explain things is different from the way children learn at school. And there's always, if you have children, you've probably seen that conflict. But if your pre-recorded lecture exists online for the student to access, that helps the parent also give a better support to their children by listening to you and listening to your version of it and going exactly the way you would like the child to learn. So that's the great advantage of pre-recorded sessions. So I do not believe that live sessions like Zoom sessions, it's not a good use of your time to be explaining things. However, once you have explained in a pre-recorded video about how to add fractions, when you have children together, perhaps as a group, you can discuss more complicated, what if both denominators are prime numbers? Then that becomes a little harder. How do you tell hard problems from easy problems? Talk about problems rather than discuss how to solve the problems. So this is a math example. Even in science, you can see a similar, I just want to remind you that I'm picking up some background noise. So kindly, if you are not muted, do remember to be muted. Thank you. So yeah, so science and math are subjects where there is a lot of technical content that the students need to understand before they can apply it or play with the topic itself. So those are subjects that easily lend itself to pre-recorded lectures followed by small group discussions, so problem solving sessions, or you give them a bunch of problems to solve and then you come back together in a live session if you can, and then see which were the problems that students were having most trouble with. Maybe they can explain to each other. If you students who can explain it to each other, that's even better. Sometimes students explaining to each other is easier than the teacher explaining to the student. We have seen that collaborative learning of this kind is very powerful. Students tend to recall things better when they have struggled with a problem and collaboratively figured out something. The way they tend to retain that information is for longer than something that they just heard the teacher explain. So collaborative learning is a very powerful learning. Helping students engage with struggling to figure a problem does lead to deeper learning. So that is one way you can think about it. If you're a history or a civics teacher, maybe you don't have to record. Pre-record lectures, always a great idea, but maybe you don't have to do that because you don't want to tell a long story of, say, the First War of Independence. You want to take it in pieces. So what you might do there is provide some readings. There are hundreds of videos out there, documentaries and stuff that you might be able to share with your students, videos either that you created or someone else created. Even scenes from movies is a great way. There's so many movies made of historical topics. I pick some scenes from the movies to highlight some aspect of what you are trying to teach. Discussions on historical events and analysis of these events. This is how you teach history and civics. A lot of times you get the question from the students, why am I learning this, right? They don't see the context of history. You learn history to understand how the world was has come to be as we know it. And so history becomes very boring when it is a recollection of dates and events. History becomes interesting when you see how that has influenced the freedoms you have today, the rights you have today, and ways in which you operate in society today. So being able to engage in discussions around historical events and how that has influenced events is really important. So now in context, it can be that you've provided readings, you've provided videos, and in your Zoom sessions, it's about discussion. And again, not about a one-way talk, because if it's a one-way talk, that's your biggest clue that's offloadable to technology. If you find yourself talking to your students most of the time in Zoom, then that is your clue number one as to the fact that you can easily pre-record and offload that to technology. Don't waste bandwidth and time and effort just to repeat something that you can easily be repeating. Now, languages are a little more tricky to do online. So if it's English, it's different. If you're in an English medium school and if you're teaching English, they're obviously at a much different level than, say, if you're teaching Hindi or French or another second language. So depending on that subject, the idea here is not so much to get them to engage in a lot of reading, but engage them in using the language. These are trying times. These are difficult times. We are not trying here to complete syllabus or complete the curriculum first. That is not the priority. The priority here is to keep students engaged in learning. There's a word that we use in the US called summer slide. It represents, at the end of June, before we let go for the academic year, there's a level at which the students are. And then they're gone for June, July, and August, and they come back in September. And a lot of students are actually at a slightly lower level when it comes to reading and mathematical ability than when they left school. Why is that? That is because they had such a long break in between where they have not been engaged in learning activities. So here, at this point, I think our priority should be to avoid a corona slide. So, children who are sitting at home and not doing anything are going to go down, and that's good for them. It's not good as educators, because when they come back to class, it will be our responsibility to knock them back up. So our idea is to prevent the corona slide, prevent our students from going below what they left your school with. So the idea is to engage them in learning, engage them in thinking about historical events, engage them in reviewing math content, engage them in language activities. So don't worry too much about, no, I was supposed to teach them words and adjectives and nouns. No, let's hold on to that. Let's think about how can we get them to practice their French, practice their Hindi, practice whatever language it is that you can teach them. It could be through movies again, it could be them recording themselves, reading a passage from any book. Definitely textbooks are always a little, students reading textbooks, they think of it as work, but when students are reading other materials like storybooks or something online, they're much more interested in it. So if you're a French teacher, you might have them read the headlines from a French newspaper that's online, or something, record themselves doing that and send it to you. So these kind of activities where you get students to engage in learning and keep that learning going, so that we're preventing them from having a corona slide, and when they come back to class, at least at the level at which they left, and we can work our way beyond that. So again, as I said, context matters, right? So I don't know, you're all across India and the world, even here in the US, even in this very state that we are in, Pennsylvania, there is a big difference in access to technology where my university is. Our university is in Philadelphia. Within the district of Philadelphia is different from just outside Philadelphia, which is reasonably access, to outside the suburbs where the access goes down again. So in a 20-mile radius, you find every single possibility of very low access, medium access, high access, everything's in between in a 20-mile radius. And I suspect that is similar for most of you too, wherever you are. And so depending on your student target audience, if they have high access to technology and most of them have broadband access at home, then definitely pre-recorded lecture, then your choices are endless, right? You can do anything. You can do pre-recorded live discussions, online assignments, everything. So that's the easy part. The second and the third groups are slightly hard. This. So medium access to technology, like it's basic internet, in which case live sessions like Zoom become harder to do. You might consider that once a week or one every other week, but even that might be asking for too much. Pre-recorded lectures, voice over power, that might require more tech, but voice over PowerPoint slides. So a lot of teachers know how to use PowerPoint, but if you can figure out how to put voice on top of those PowerPoint slides, that's a very good way to walk your children through graphics and notes that would keep them scaffold their understanding as you are going through a particular topic. Online discussions, as I mentioned, students talking to each other to negotiate ideas and meaning is a powerful way to engage them in learning. So online discussions, if you have a tool that you already do that in school with, that's great, but even a Google document can be a good space for online discussion. You can create, if your children have never engaged in this kind of activity before, you might be very structured. For example, you might have a Google Doc with a table with every child's name in it, and you have a question about what do you think was the most important historic event between 1850 and 1870. Now that's a question to them, and they all can, against their name, they can all put their answers down. And once they have their answers, you can create a third column after create and say, I would like you now to respond to somebody else's post, and maybe you agree with them, maybe you don't agree with them, respectfully. And this is another to build digital literacy skills, where you're helping students engage in a conversation about why I agree with you or why I do not agree with you respectfully. So initially you might have to do the entire scaffolding, but once students get used to it, you will see that they are much more able to engage in online conversations. So online discussions can be facilitated through Google Docs or Google Sheets, or sometimes online discussions can be facilitated through Google Slides. I saw this one activity where a teacher asked them to, there was a class of like, I think 30 students, and she had one Google slide, and she said, everybody, and they were, I forgot which was, it was a Shakespearean play. It was Hamlet. Now the teacher said, everybody take one slide, and I want you to represent what your favorite scene or something that touched you, something that stays with you. I want you to represent that on one of these slides. So every child got a slide, and some kids made a collage, some kids made text-based things. They used their creativity to indicate which part of that particular piece stood out to them. And once everybody had created, you could literally see how after one child sees what the other child has done, they go back and they fix theirs to be a little more better. The entire class is looking at what each other is doing, and don't think of this as copying or cheating. It's not. It is developing. It's when you see an idea that you're like, oh, you know what, that's a great idea. I should do something like that. As a result, all the students continually improve their slides, and you can literally see through the versions of their slides how the sophistication of their expression, their creativity improved over the time that the teacher had given. That was an English assignment, right? It was a literature assignment. However, they built digital literacy skills. They were engaged in creativity. They were engaged in so many soft skills development through that one exercise. And once everybody was done, then the teacher asked them to go to each other's slides and comment on what you like best and what you, any suggestion that you have. This might look like a very, fluffy assignment, but let me assure you that the AC or that the students had over their reading, they actually had to go back and look and think through what in this particular chapter or whatever is most meaningful to me. Why is it meaningful to me? How do I represent that? And that kind of engagement is what you're looking for in your students, not just their ability to memorize Shakespeare and throw it back, into a paper. So those are again, those are Google Slides. It doesn't require that much bandwidth to be able to access Google Slides. So that's, again, online discussions. It is basically the teacher's creativity on how you can prompt, structure, and scaffold online to help your students engage in this content. Now, the third group is going to be the hardest, where it's low access to technology and low bandwidth. You might have students, maybe they're, they have one computer, the parents are using it most of the time because the parents have to work from home. That's possible. And they get it only in the evening for a few hours. It is possible that because of the lockdown and other things, I know especially in the Middle East, in the evenings is much harder to access to have a good bandwidth because everyone's online. During the daytime, it's a little easier. So if your students have low access to technology or low bandwidth, then you have to think a little more in terms of just PowerPoint slides, providing the notes with guiding questions, and using PDF and Word documents instead of more interactive formats. And phone, always, like WhatsApp based help sessions. That's a possibility if you have access to that. So who are your students? What is the access they have? And how much time do they have? All of this would be contextual constraints that decide what you can do and not. So I'm going to pause right here, and I'm going to ask Lata or Pradipta sir, are there any questions in chat or that you think I might need to answer? I'm sorry if I'm monitoring chat.
No, that's absolutely fine. Betty, actually, Michael is doing a fabulous job of answering the questions, so I'm so happy about it. So all the questions that has been asked are been answered by Michael already, at least that is on the chat box. I'm not very sure about Facebook, but I don't see anything coming up from Lata from Facebook.
All right, so a couple of slides. I will go back. I will ask you again.
I think so. Michael has to say something.
I just was going to say, it looked like a couple of people had raised their hands earlier. I don't know what those questions were, but I didn't have access to those questions, so I couldn't respond.
We have no questions from Facebook yet. I think we can go ahead and come back probably if we have a question.
Okay, so just to let you know, because I'm sharing my screen, if you raise your hands, I won't be able to see it because I'm actually seeing my screen and not the folks that I'm speaking to. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put that in the chat box, or if you are watching on Facebook, please feel free to put that as a question, so the facilitators helping me here can be sure to ask me the question in a couple of slides. Thank you. Just a reminder, again, I'm picking up a lot of background noise, so if you are not muted, it's just a friendly reminder to be sure to be muted. Thank you. So here's a chart that helps you think about what is your access to technology, and just in terms of bandwidth, right? So here up on this side, or on the y-axis as you would call it, is the high bandwidth, and the low bandwidth is at the bottom. And in terms of immediacy, so if it's something that the students, you have time, that's the low immediacy, but something you need to get to the students right away, that's high immediacy. So in terms of, if you have high bandwidth and you need the students to engage in something now, so a video conference, right? Because you have the time to be making Zoom videos and posting it. So something that's quick, needs to get to the students now, and they have access to high bandwidth. Video conferences and audio conferences are the way to go. Now, if they don't have the bandwidth, these are students with low connection, etc., then group chat messaging or Google Docs with lots of instructions, that is the kind of things you could do if you need to get to the students now. And so quick notifications, quick instructions, quick check-ins, whatever that may be, depending on your bandwidth, those are your options. However, if you do have high bandwidth and you have time, the students need to get this material only next week, then of course pre-recorded video is one of the best ways to go. I explained a few minutes ago why I think that's a great idea. Asynchronous discussions with video. So asynchronous sometimes depending on your student's age group, especially if you are dealing with fourth graders or fourth standard students or fifth standard students, and that's not a that they don't like to write too much. And they usually, while some of them may be creative writers, they're usually more used to writing just in the context of classrooms. So for that group, having a tool like, I think some of you may have heard of tools like Flipgrid. Flipgrid is a tool where you as a teacher can pose a question. So my question is, read a poem. What do you think about this poem? Or what is the author the poet trying to communicate through this poem? Now, instead of getting students to write it, you can just get them to record themselves saying, I think this poet is trying to share the sadness of losing something, whatever that poem might have been. So getting younger kids to record their opinions or record their matter is actually a good way, and that's possible through a tool called Flipgrid. So again, discussion videos, or in higher classes, you ask more about what is your opinion about something, right? How do you understand something? Asynchronous video discussions are a great way because our children are spending so much time just reading and text and text and text. So asynchronous video discussions, which is different from text-based discussions that I spoke about a few minutes ago. Asynchronous discussion, which is just audio-based, is another option, pre-recorded audio. Now, low bandwidth and low immediacy, that's when you create text-based materials. So, PDFs, Word documents, PowerPoint slides with notes, discussion boards with images. This is, again, depending on your access, this might be some easier ways to go. And again, email, if your students have access to it. Sometimes just emailing students things are, again, low bandwidth, low immediacy ways to go. So, and this is a chart that I have used during normal times. I'm forgetting what it even look like given the happenings of the last 2 months, but there was once a normal time. And I always ask teachers to look at this chart and think about in class, when you're using technology, how do these technologies support your teaching? Don't think about, so a lot of times, especially here in the US, we see that the school district or the management will purchase a technology and it's given to the teachers and the teachers have to use it. And so they're just using it because they have it. And, I've always discouraged using something because the management or the school gave it to you. Use something because it adds value to the way you teach and do things. So when you think about technology, you can think about 4 categories or families of technologies that help you do things. So one category of technology is that those things that help students learning, that helps students understand the content, and that helps students create things. So for example, if you use a PhET simulation. I don't know if there are any chemistry teachers in this group, and if you have not used PhET simulations, I request you to Google PHET simulations. Science teachers generally, not just chemistry teachers, science teachers, Google PhET simulations, not now, please stay with us right now. When you're done with this, go ahead and Google it and you will find a lot of valuable simulations that you can use in class. Even if you don't have technology in class, perhaps you can give it as a resource to students. Even if you have smartboard and demonstrate it, it's awesome. But if you're still in Blackboard classroom, that's fine too. If kids have access to this technology at home. Getting to visualize science is such an important part of understanding science. In this day and age, in 2020, we should not rely on just the imagination of children to figure out how atoms behave. We should be able to support them with real simulations and technologies so that their imagination is complemented and they can actually visualize scientific phenomena. And so PhET simulations are a great way. I think it's from the University of Colorado. I don't remember who created it, but it is free for teachers to use. So any resource that I talk about in this segment will always be free resources that's available for teachers. And so those kind of technologies that help you understand content, that helps you see things that's otherwise unseeable. Even using a video, you're teaching about cells. And I remember back, before the days of technology, my teacher used to come with colored chalk and would draw an amoeba, the outer layer and then the inner layer, and then mark all the parts. And it was an entire period wasted because the teacher was not wasted, but the teacher went through a lot of drawing. Imagine how we can just bring in a PowerPoint slide or a chart with that. So easy to print things. It's so easy to access. You just saved yourself 35 minutes of drawing. How are you going to use that to help students learn? That's the question. What all is done for you. Anything that helps students visualize and understand is that first category. The second category I mentioned together, learning together is a great way. So any tool that helps students talk to each other, work with each other, discuss with each other, collaborate with each other. You may use social media, but there's a danger of social media. I don't need to tell you educators how that is. But if you have school-bound social media where anything you know that so-and-so posted it, it's easier to get students to actually engage in good conversation. So learning by collaboration is another set of tools. Learning is, so there's this idea of anytime, any place learning. So, for example, there's a lot of research that has shown that teenagers work better in the evenings or late mornings. And the same research that shows that very early in the morning, it's hard for them to focus. It's hard for them to stay on track. I have 2 teenagers in the house, and I can tell you that is absolutely the case. So, but unfortunately, school systems are set so that you have to start at 7 a.m. Most high schools here in the United States start at 7:30. I don't think I know of any high school that's later than 7:30. The idea is to get students, high school students, starting early so that they can be out of school early, they can go get a job, they can engage in sports, all of that stuff. So, but all of these schools starts late, so early. However, if we had resources for students that if they were groggy in the morning, but in the evening as they're doing their homework, they can access what you explained in the morning about ecosystems or integration and differentiation and all of these complex topics that they learn in high school. If they would re-access that material in the evening, how much more is that going to support your students? So there's anything that can support anytime, any place learning. So, if you laptop programs and all of these ways in which you pre-record and give students material so that in the evening, when they are ready to struggle with your difficult topics in physics and science and chemistry, whatever it may be, that's when that kind of tools are called the tools that support anytime, any place learning. And of course, there is a host of technologies that support learning by gaming, playing games. That's another option, great way to, there's tons of literature on there, and I'm also conscious of time. I want to leave some time in the end to take questions. So I'm going to just through this, but again, feel free to Google some of these things, and if you're not able to find resources, do get in touch. Hopefully we'll be able to share this particular PowerPoint and some other resources when we are done. So one thing to remember at this time, again, we are in a very unique time and space in history, and so it does look like students are friendly reminder to mute your phones, because I think I'm picking up some noise. May I ask one of the co-hosts to mute the phone, microphone of whoever? Thank you, that works. So our students are under a lot of stress, even though it's not very evident. So students, they thrive in friends. Again, even my teenagers are missing their friends a lot. They get their energy from being with friends. And now being inside 4 walls is very stressful for them. Another thing is that we think of students, they have their phones, we think of them as digital natives and expect them a lot more in world of them. So these are 2 things we need to keep in our mind. Students are good with technology for communicating with friends and sharing stuff, but using technology to learn with is a different skill set. And using technology to learn with requires some amount of metacognition, understanding how you learn, some amount of self-direction, and some amount of self-motivation. So just because students are good with technology, that does not mean they are good with technology for learning. And so do not have unrealistic expectations of your students. Also be mindful that students are under stress. It might not be evident, but they are, and being mindful about how you support them through this time. And also, you know, there's many other things, like some students like to talk, some people are very uncomfortable watching themselves on screen, and, you know, just seeing their own face on screen makes them very uncomfortable. But you have to get used to it, but be sure to support your students in every different way you can. Secondly, this idea of active learning. As I mentioned, this online learning for us is going to be, at this point at least, a passing phase. We are trying to keep our students engaged in learning while they cannot be in our classrooms. In that case, be sure to strive towards active learning. You should do even in classroom, but especially at this time, you don't want them memorizing facts and figures and, you know, just this old way of doing things. You have to move away. Think about how to think about these topics, to engage with these topics, to mull over that in their head, and how can we force them to create things that requires them to deeply consider these ideas that you have shared, whatever your topics are. And then give yourself grace. Like, no one's going to get good at this week, right? As online teachers have been teaching for years. So give yourself grace. Don't think that you're going to be an awesome online teacher and then you start things and things fail, and then don't let yourself be dismayed. Don't worry about it. Mistakes happen. And so the idea is, you will not become an expert, but every single lesson you create makes you better teacher, online teacher, than the last lesson you made. So learn from your mistakes, be reflective teachers, and avoid perfectionist tendencies. Don't worry if you make a mistake, that's fine. Don't worry if your Zoom call fails. Don't worry if your notes were not that great. Don't worry if some parent complained. Everything is a learning experience, and you will just use that to build your repertoire as a teacher. Expect glitches, especially now. Suddenly, I've been teaching online for 5-6 years now, mostly professional development, mostly for teachers. This last 3 months has been the hardest, simply because the connections have not been as stable as for the past 5 years, because the entire world has gone online. Every tool is glitchy. It's more glitchy than I can ever remember it. So expect glitches. Even the experts are struggling with the same issues. I will stop here before I go to the next slide, and I will take some questions. Lata, Pradipta sir?
Yes, so we have a couple of questions from Facebook Live. There is Shweta and Varsha, who are both asking about how online teaching can be done best for kindergarten and primary students. And there are a lot of questions coming about how assessments can be done online.
That is a great question. So let me just write that down. So kindergarten and primary students, great question. Obviously, you don't want them sitting in front of Zoom call and listening to you teach. What do you do usually? Again, it's been a few years since I've worked with that age group. So, but again, when you're in kindergarten and primary, what are some of the things you want your students to do? I'm thinking, kindergarten especially, you teach them colors and animals and shapes and some letters. Those, I'm assuming that's what's happening. Now, again, you can go to do activities such as find 3 circles in your house, like go around the house and find 3 circles. Find a doorknob, they might find a bangle, they might find a bottle cap, and then they can either draw that into a paper and take a picture, of course with the assistance of their parents, or they can just collect some photographs itself. And so activities engage them in identifying things in the real world, right? So find 3 things in your house that are red, 5 things in your house. So ways in which you are developing those kind of observational skills, or even 3 things in your house that start with the letter P. So they have to find a pen, they find a penguin, picture of a penguin, whatever. So every giving them tasks that they have to go around the house and find something. That's like one example. You could also, depending on how your students are, do they have access to a computer. That Google Slides thing that I told you, that's a way that students can actually find pictures. They don't have to find it in their house. Just find 3 pictures of animals that start with, I don't know, B. So they find a bear, they find a, okay, somebody help me here. Well, you can imagine, find the pictures and share it. So they're not only learning the names of animals, but they're also learning the sounds and things like that. So the idea for kindergarten and first graders is really to learn to identify things around them, sounds of words, colors, etc., and giving them activities that scaffold that. And when it comes to reading, right, first grade students, getting so important. There are many skills that you can teach later, but in that kindergarten, first grade time, you want the students to absolutely engage in reading. And so you could read with them, like if they I don't know if they've already purchased textbooks in your school. This was a very odd time that we went into lockdown. If they have the textbooks, even your pre-recorded versions of reading the stories with expression, with whatever, you know, with whatever, however you do it in class, there might be other things out there the students can do. But when students see you, who have been teaching them all this while, when they see your face, it's like comfort food. You know, let's do it for young children to listen to their teacher is very different from listening to somebody, even Bill Gates or some famous author or someone online. So teachers have a big role in that student's life. So your face, your voice, guiding them through activities online, if not every day, every week, is really important. Activity-based learning, things where they are creating projects, is more important than some of the other writing things to do. And yes, you know, yesterday I was speaking to someone who said she's struggling with getting her kids to write, and I said, don't make them write. Make them, like, it's very important for them to develop the fine motor skills. But if they're not writing the letter B, don't force them. I said, what looks like the letter B? You know, flowers or something. Like, tell them to draw your favorite flower or draw pictures with them. Develop fine motor skills. Because if they develop the fine motor skills, they will be able to write B when they have. Is from my professional development program. So this is geared towards adult learners. You can imagine how a version of this would look for your 5th standard English period or your 7th standard biology period. You can imagine what that might look for you. I also provide any PowerPoints that I have. And if I had a live Zoom session, I always record it and put a link on that. So this does help the student go through. This week, we learned fractions. We learned how to add fractions. Here's a video for it. Here are the problem sets I need to do. Here are the discussion boards that I can ask questions. And keeping that all streamlined in one place is really important. So if you don't have a learning management system, then provide a very clear, long syllabus for the entire time that you expect to be online. And that should have all the information the student should needs about your course. And again, you want to think about what's going to happen if your Zoom session, always have a plan B. You know, I keep telling the teachers, plan for the worst. Like just plan that in a way as if there's going to be strict social distancing rules. You cannot have your classes as before. The desks are going to be 6 feet apart. Maybe only half your students can come on Mondays. Only the other half of your students can come on Tuesdays. That is a possibility if things are going to get bad, where you cannot have 40 students in a class. That's impossible with social distancing. You can have only 20. If that's the case, half the class will come today, only half the roll numbers 1 to 20 will come today, and 21 to 40 will come tomorrow. So in such kind of situations, plan for the worst and hope for the best. That's the best we could do. So what's your plan B? If you have every activity that is technology based should have a plan B. So if you are having a Zoom session and it doesn't work, what is your plan B? If you have students who might get sick, it's a pandemic out there. It is possible some of your kids might get sick or their parents might get sick. How do you assist them? What kind of accommodations do you make for those students? Are you going to, what kind of things are you going to do? Record your lectures, meet live, both, neither? If your LMS, that's learning management system, or if your syllabus, or if your Google Drive is designed to support your students, all of this is possible. So in what ways you will support your students is completely left to you. And so it is almost the end of time. So I'm going to stop my PowerPoint and take any last questions that we might have. Lata, Pradipta sir, with 1 minute to go, do we have any questions? I'm not sure I hear anything.
I think Michael's been answering most of them on chat. So,
right.
So there is one question on how do we conduct co-curricular activities?
Co-curricular activities, yeah. Again, so are we expecting, even if it's a co-curricular activity, I always think there's a learning objective to it. So is it, for example, when you have, say, a school play, when you have a school play, taking a school play online is very hard, but are there ways in which you can adopt technology? When we have a school play, what are the things we want to teach students to act? We want them to be able to memorize lines. We want them to be able to show expressions, whatever other things might be. What is the best way? I've heard of teachers using school plays in coordinate. I've heard choirs sing together. I've heard dramas just being read out simultaneously on Zoom. So it is a question of using your creativity to ask yourself, what is the learning objective? What is it that I want the students to gain from this? And you might, obviously, some of our standard co-curricular activities like sports and games, we might have to forego for a while. But things like elocution competitions, we can totally do that even now, right? You're actually giving them, the students, to the option of doing their best. So there have been times when you've memorized your speech and then you go on stage and you completely blank out, right? So here it's a different one. You're recording yourself and you get many chances to watch yourself re-record. You have to take a different approach to giving students second, third, fourth chances, and the best particular performance or the best rendition wins. So whatever you can do with Zoom, you have to do, and some of the other things we'll just have to forego for the time being.
Okay. The other question is how much screen time is okay per section, like for primary or for middle school or for secondary section, how much screen time is good?
So I think the research on those kind of things is all over the place, but it's very clear, as little as possible, right? So some say 2 hours, some say 3 hours. And it's, again, it is about, I would say, engage students in screen, try and minimize that screen time, because as it is, the only way parents can keep their kids occupied sometimes is by giving them a screen. So you want to not add to that in some ways. You want to try and make sure that what you are doing has a specific purpose and that you are scaffolding their learning in some ways. The rest of the things that you assign should be, go hunt for it, go find it, go think about it, draw something, do something. So your part is recording yourself, giving instructions, and then what the student needs to be doing after that should, as far as possible, be non-screen. I would say 2 hours to 3 hours seems reasonable, but the lesser, the better. That, again, that's a personal opinion. Research is pretty much scattered on that basis.
There are quite a few questions about how to deal with students, how to teach online for students with special needs and learning difficulties. So there are questions from teachers asking how can we teach a computer practical subject or something like home science, which is about nutrients and food.
Yeah, in these kind of things, I think, especially if the student has special needs, or the student has a reading disability or dyslexia or things like that, you absolutely need the help of the parents. So you, in that case, you have to, I mean, normal times you're in school, you're with them, you don't need that assistance. But with special needs, if you have students like that, you have to gear your education not towards the student, it towards the parent, and enlist the parents' help in saying, okay, in the next 2 weeks, these are the things I want your child to develop. I want your child to develop an understanding of textures, or if it's something to do with food science, I want them to understand acidity versus something, whatever you do in food science. And it is giving parents the muscle to help their child is the way to go, especially if it's a special needs child.
Copyright issues that should be kept in mind in using internet resources for online classes?
Copyright issues. So again, a lot of resources out there are permissible for education. So copyright, as teachers, if you're not creating, for example, a PowerPoint and then you are selling your workshop for money, if that's not what you're doing, then most of the time it's permissible for educational purposes. And again, thinking about using something now in the next month or 2 months or 3 months as we are dealing with this is different from thinking more long term. So if you're not monetarily gaining from it, then I think a lot of copyright issues becomes less important. I'm not saying ignore it. I'm just saying that those are less worrisome for you as a teacher to teach your class rather than to be using them for some kind of workshop that you're charging.
And one other thing to that point, many organizations, commercial publishers, et cetera, that have a lot of private for-fee curriculum are making them available for free at this time. So again, as Betty said, this is a perfect time to reach out and try to leverage those, but think differently in the long run. But in the short run, as she said, no lawyer is going to track you down and say this is a problem when you're trying to do the best for your students.
And I think with that, we will end this session. Thank you so much for patiently staying with us this entire hour. And again, best of luck to all the educators and teachers out there. I know we always talk about the great service by the first responders and the medics and the grocery store workers, but people forget that the teachers are struggling too. So here's my applause to all the teachers out there, and please give each other an applause for all the hard work that you're doing and the great work you're doing for our children. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Please be kind to yourself. That's the most important. Be realistic and kind to yourself, and know you are heroes, and really what you're doing is amazing work. So we really are very, very grateful for that.
Okay. Hi, my name is Surabhi, and wow, wasn't that just an excellent session? We had more than 400 people joining this session via Zoom and so many more on Facebook as well. Thank you, Michael and Betty. You both have been friends of ABEA and all the educators in India. Thank you always for being so generous in sharing your knowledge and best practices. We are really lucky to have access to the both of you. Today's session was full of so many practical examples and tips to help teachers manage this unusual situation. And many of us may think that the bandwidth issues are limited to smaller towns in India, but guess what? It happens in Pennsylvania as well. What is heartening to know is that it is not a limitation. We just need to think out of the box. Okay, so I'm saying thank you, Michael, for being Google today, and thank you, participants, for joining in. We will continue with these master classes, and we hope to see you again. And like Michael said, be kind to each another and stay safe. Thank you so much for your time today.